Hello everyone. This is the sixth part of the story, Abe the Wizard. Chapter 28, Preparation Before Battle. Uncle Marshall, when I was on my way back from Harvest City, I witnessed a village that was attacked by the orcs. It was located between the castle and Harvest City. When Knight Marshall heard about this affair, he immediately notified his steward Lindsay, ring the alarm bell now and get all the villagers from all of our territories to enter the castle for shelter now. When they are inside, make sure you verify their identity as well. Yes, my lord, Lindsay quickly said and promptly hurried out. Uncle Marshall, I've prepared a present for you. I originally intended to give this present to you later for your birthday. But with the current circumstances we have on our hands, I think you should have it now so that it could increase your strength. Abel then brought out a deluxe version of an ice magic sword of 100 skills directly from his bag. When they returned to the castle, Abel went into the operations room and took out another piece of the deluxe ice magic sword of 100 skills, which was also originally prepared for Marshall's birthday. However, he decided to give the deluxe version of the ice magic sword of 100 skills directly to Knight Marshall right now. This was a crucial move for Abel since increasing their fighting strength was what mattered the most right now. Once again, Abel took out another piece of the deluxe version of the ice magic sword of 100 skills. There wasn't much time left to lose, so Abel also handed it over into the hands of Knight Marshall. A magic sword. The Knight Marshall pulled out the sword as he gently touched the sword with touched at his fingers. He then hastily shook off the frost on his hand and said excitedly, "Wow, this is a magic ice sword. That's the good stuff." He then turned around and looked undeviatingly at Abel and stated, "Bentham had been researching the forging process of magic weapons for a long time. Looks like his hard work has finally paid off. This was my gift to you. How could you say that it was forged from Master Bentham?" Abel felt a sense of speechlessness to see that the gift that he made was being said to be made by someone else's. Knight Marshall couldn't believe it. He was speechless for a while. "Abel, you made this sword?" Knight Marshall questioned him with a sense of disbelief. Abel remained silent. He then pointed directly to his own master blacksmith's medal on his chest. It was then that Knight Marshall has finally just realized that Abel had an extra medal carried on him. "You're a master blacksmith?" After hearing what Abel said, Knight Marshall was suddenly in doubt of the entire world and his whole existence. Since when could a 13-year-old novice like you can become a master blacksmith? "The trip that I took to Harvest City was for evaluating the weapons I've made," Abel said. Was this true? Knight Marshall's facial expression immediately shifted from being astonished to being wildly excited. He then began to laugh frantically in joy. "Ha, ha ha ha, wahaha. We have a master blacksmith here in our own home. Hey, Abel, I want the best magic armor, the strongest magic shield, a magic knight firearm. Oh, I almost forgot, I also want a magical bow too." Abel looked at the already overly enthusiastic Knight Marshall. He headed out of the room without even bothering to look back. According to what Knight Marshall had requested, it would have required all the best blacksmiths in the blacksmith union. All for a silly dream such as this. All of a sudden, the bell rang heavily. There were 20 soldiers wearing leather armors and equipped with long guns. They rode their horses as they gathered in front of the castle. The Knight Marshall immediately changed into his imitation blazing sun armor as he jumped onto his personal white warhorse. His horse was way more powerful than any other ordinary warhorses. It was tall and equipped with the deluxe edition of the Sword of 100 Skills, Abel's gift. On his hand, he was carrying a knight's rifle as he stood in front of his squad of cavalry soldiers preparing to give a speech. Those filthy orcs had appeared again. "My soldiers, let's get our weapons ready, together we will defend our homeland from these orcs." After hearing Knight Marshall's motivating address, the soldiers were all aroused and were all ready to go into battle to fight bravely. If anyone managed to slay an orc himself, it would be considered an outstanding military service. In the past, the only way to achieve an outstanding military service was to serve as a guard in Miracle City. Now, this opportunity was everywhere. To Abel, he thought the soldiers at Harry's castle were brave and steadfast. An entire platoon of 20 horses, along with the costs of training for these soldiers. Only the wealthy and powerful people like Bentham's masters could have afforded such a group of well-trained elite soldiers. At the Bennet castle, a sweaty messenger quickly approached the Knight Bennet and handed him a parcel. He quickly told the butler to give a small reward to compensate the messenger as he returned immediately back to his room with the parcel. When the Knight Bennet opened the package, he spotted a large sword and 2 enclosed letters. One of the letters was from Knight Marshal, informing him about the recent attacks that occurred on the villages as well as to raise their awareness and to scout out for any future orc attacks that may occur. The other letter was from Abel, which read, "Your birthday present came early." When Knight Bennet pulled out a large sword from his package, he immediately recognized that something was different about this sword. The value of the sword he had just pulled out was immeasurable. When he found out that the sword was an ice magical sword, the Knight of Bennet immediate felt a heart full of sentiment. Even though Abel had become the adopted son of someone else, Abel was still willing to spend a large amount to purchase an ice magical sword as a present for the Knight of Bennet to protect himself after he realized the orcs were now roaming around. These days, the Knight Bennet was already filled with regrets for letting Abel get adopted. If had realized that Abel had forged this sword himself, who knows how much more regretful could he get. When Abel traveled to the blacksmith store earlier today, everyone who saw him including his apprentices was all gazing at him differently. They all seemed to obtain a sense of respect for Abel. People were now addressing him as Master Abel, but he seemed to be stressed whenever he heard people calling him by the title of Master. However, Abel was no longer an undistinguished ordinary blacksmith, he was now a blacksmith master, which required him to be less humble and modest about his identity as he was now representing an entire community, the highest of the blacksmith union. When Abel went back into the store, he went into his dedicated operations room and locked himself inside. Ever since he started forging weapons, he always had a low requirement for his equipment. Although he could forge a sword of 100 skills, he had never truly forged a customized weapon for himself. The only sword that he had with him was the magic ice sword which was forged during the blacksmith examination. Why didn't Abel forge weapons for himself? Firstly, Abel himself was not in any particular danger back then. He had never thought that it would be in use and it would be wasteful to leave it there to rust. Secondly, his body was growing speedily due to puberty. This meant that the equipment that he made now would be wasted as the equipment that he crafted would not be able to fit him as he grew even 1 year older. However, in the current situation, the chances of a battle happening were extremely likely. So Abel finally decided to forge a few pieces of protective gear just in case. By doing so, the new equipment would greatly enhance Abel's chance of remaining alive. The upcoming battle looked as though it would determine the life and death of Abel and everyone he knew. Firstly, Abel had to experiment a little bit with his current concept. He then wore some very thick gloves and placed a ceramic bottle into the furnace. After it was burning for a while, he took out the ceramic bottle with iron clamps, then directly threw a bucket of iced water at it. Almost at the same time, Abel stuffed the ceramic bottle in the Horadric Cube and pressed start. Although Abel saw that the ceramic bottle had entered inside the Horadric Cube, there was not a change ever since Abel took it out of the furnace. After remaining silent in deep thought, suddenly Abel realized that the body of the ceramic bottle seemed to have some cracks them. As soon as Abel moved a single heartbeat, the ceramic bottle appeared on his hands. At the same time, he slammed the ceramic bottle into a pile of debris and as it fell to the ground, everything was shattered to pieces. It worked. Abel rejoiced and immediately felt a sense of relief and satisfaction in his heart. Now, Abel had to forge a piece of a large magic sword. The current pace he had right now was considered very quick already. Normally it would take around 5 hours on average to forge a magic sword. He was fast enough now to take 5 hours to make a big magic sword. With the magic sword now in the process of being forged, Abel intentionally wanted to write a few runes differently. He added a lot of useless strokes connecting in the most complicated way. During the final step, when he was leading the magical power of the blue gem to the center of the runes, the moment before the white light flashed, he shoved the sword into the Horadric Cube. With the leftover time, Abel worked extremely hard to create an oversized shield of 100 skills. The shield was as thick as 30 centimeters. If Abel wasn't a level 5 knight, he wouldn't even be able to lift this gigantic shield. Abel then took the failed magic ice sword that he just made from the Horadric Cube. This time Abel had learned his lesson. The moment he took out the sword, he threw it outside and he counted slowly, 1, 2, 3, in his head. When Abel counted to 3, he heard a loud bang outside the shield, followed by a chaotic noise of ding ding dong dong. It sounded like the shield being struck by 1,000 spears. After the noise had stopped, Abel peeked his head from the back of the shield. The explosion was much larger this time. The large stone wall was pierced with countless scattered pieces, some even seemed to have made a small hole on the wall. When Abel saw his shield, he was so deeply shocked that his entire body felt like they were drenched in cold sweat. There were holes everywhere on his shield and the holes looked as if they were hit by bullets. It was even deep enough to put a finger through. If Abel wasn't holding an extra thick shield, he might have been heavily wounded from the blast of the sword. Abel couldn't believe that by adding a few rune circuits, the effect of the explosion would have increased by such a significant amount. What would have happened if a sword like this were thrown in the middle of a crowd? Abel thought to himself. Abel could only imagine the catastrophic accidents it would have caused. No one could have survived a blast that strong. Of course, such a highly dangerous weapon had to be stored in the Horadric Cube, so a weapon like this could only be Abel's secret weapon. The Horadric Cube was the most important secret of Abel. His success was entirely aided with the assistance. Therefore, Abel would not let anyone who had a glimpse of it remain alive. In the evening, Abel did not return to the castle to rest. He stayed up the entire night to forge 3 pieces of exploding swords to be stored within the Horadric Cube. In the meantime, Abel had also learned self-defense and how to properly protect himself. Abel suddenly thought about the grenades in the original old world. The explosion that had just occurred was similar to the explosion of grenades. According to what Abel learned from the era of the explosion, the safest place to survive after a grenade exploded would be on the ground, even though there would be shockwaves. Based on the original world's concept of the tank cannon bounce shells, Abel built a much smaller shield that could be hung around the waist. During the explosion, the person could reduce the number of damage in an explosion by lying on the ground, and then using the small shield to bounce off the pieces of debris at different oblique angles. Chapter 29, Large Beast Traps. Abel returned to the castle the next morning. After he had breakfast and rested for 2 hours, he returned to his private operation room in the blacksmith's guild. For the trillionth time, Abel was a bodybuilding trainer in his previous life. He was used to going hiking with his friends in the wild, which made him have a lot of experience in hunting. This time, Abel wanted to make a giant bear trap according to his memories. As Master Bentham suggested, the wolf riders were very fast and flexible. They would often implement a hit-and-run strategy during battle. If they didn't have a large number of soldiers to surround them, it would be very difficult to annihilate them. However, things would be completely different if we could make a large bear trap. If a wolf rider stepped on it, it would at the very least injure their leg. This could hugely reduce their speed, therefore they will no longer be a threat. The beasts and humans of this world were both much stronger than the beasts and humans in the previous incarnation of Earth. Thus, Abel thought that he needed something special to stop these wolf riders. The components of the gigantic bear trap consisted of a large compression spring, 2 charm clamps, a clamp trigger, a button, and a chain. After the compression spring was flattened with force, it was gently held secured with the clamp trigger. If someone stepped on it, the 2 sharp clamps would be released instantaneously, catching the prey with a tremendous amount of rebound force. Since the 2 sharp clamps were not fully enclosed yet, the more the prey struggled, the tighter the grip would be. It would be easy to imagine if the mount wolf of a wolf rider was caught by this gigantic bear trap. With the speed of the wolf rider, The Mount Wolf would be in excruciating amounts of pain. Therefore, the wolf rider would most likely be shaken off by the Mount Wolf. This world did not have such a large bear trap, therefore the placement of the traps should not attract too much attention to the orcs, especially if we add some more camouflage to it. The process of making the trap was simple. The only trouble was the compression spring. According to Abel's memory, the steel used in the spring must require a high carbon content to maintain the steel's elasticity. Abel practiced by forging a rough model with 100 skills. After several attempts of carboizing, a lot of small samples were made according to different carboizing ratios. After testing, he decided on the best sample, and the production process was finally determined. Then, Abel began mass production. After he made 10 compression springs, there were still a lot of materials left. He then made several large spiral springs which could be used as shock absorbers when he decided to upgrade the carriage in the future. Abel did not make any other accessories of the gigantic bear trap since that would take too much time. The compression springs were the component that mattered the most. The other parts could let other blacksmiths in the blacksmith shop take care of it. Abel called his senior, Gordon, who gave him a drawn blueprint and dimensions of the bear trap's other components, and requested it to be forged in 2 days. Gordon did not have a problem with the request since he ordered a few of the most capable blacksmiths to work extra hours to complete it as soon as possible. Early next morning, when Abel arrived at the blacksmith shop, Gordon told Abel with a pair of tired red eyes, "Master Abel, all the parts are made according to your requirements, and they are placed in your operation room." Abel was very surprised. He thought that it would have taken at least 2 days, but it was finished in 1 night. Looking at the tired red eyes of Gordon, he could not help but say, "Why didn't you sleep last night? I don't need these parts in a rush." Since the blacksmiths heard that it was your command, they refused to delay it and worked overnight. Gordon did not mention himself. He only gave the credit to the other blacksmiths, who was standing in front of Abel. "Next time, when I forge a sword of 100 skill, the blacksmiths and you can watch on the side." "Now, go to rest," Abel said with a smile. "Thank you, Master Abel, I will let them know." Gordon thanked Abel and ran off. When Abel walked into the operation room, he saw a pile of accessories placed on the ground. It has been divided into 10 parts. From these details alone, it was enough to show that Gordon was a very attentive person. It took some effort to assemble such large bear traps, but Abel had always been a tough person. In half an hour, 10 large traps were fully assembled. 2 horses were brought in, and each of them was strapped with 5 large traps. After it was secured, Abel waved a hand, signaling that they were ready to go. Behind Harry Castle was a forest. Since Abel has been busy ever since he settled here, he never had the chance to explore this forest. He has heard that there were large beasts roaming around in there, therefore Abel decided this would be the place to test out his giant bear trap. Although the castle has now begun to be on guard, when Abel left the castle with the 2 horses, no guard dared to ask anything. Abel's current status was completely different from that when he first arrived. Everyone knew that Abel has now become a blacksmith's master. In this world, the title of master could be attained by the elites of that particular profession. Therefore, they would be respected no matter where they go in the Holy Continent. It was the sunniest part of the afternoon. The sun was shining through the gaps of the trees, scattering patches of lights over the fallen leaves on the ground. It made a dull crunching sound as Abel continued to walk. The horses were not very fond of the forest environment either, as their nose began to make snorting sounds. After he walked for about half an hour, Abel felt that he had arrived at the center of the forest. Although he did not see a single large beast along the way, he found a large pile of beast dung, which suggested there must be large beasts around here. The place was deserted, the last sign of civilization had already disappeared 10 minutes ago. Abel immediately knew this was the perfect place to put the bear trap since the trap was so powerful, it could not be placed anywhere close to humans. Abel squatted down to look for a beast's route on the ground. Beasts would always like to travel on the same route, and they would often leave some footprints behind. Therefore, experienced hunters would always know where the best place to set their traps. Although Abel didn't have as much experience, he was still trained in this aspect. So after careful observation, he found a beast's route. He immediately took out 2 gigantic bear traps from the horses. Then, he opened the clamps by force and secured the trigger. There were many techniques when it came to the placements of bear traps. You had to inspect the beast's route properly in order to speculate the steps they would take. Even if the beast could dodge the first bear trap, it would not be able to escape the second one. After the installation, Abel made an arrow marking on a tree. This mark was a reminder of where Abel had placed the trap and would make sure he wouldn't step in it himself. However, since there were arrows on the marking pointing towards different directions, it also allowed Abel to less likely get lost in the forest. Abel continued to move forward. Every 10 minutes, he would find a place to put the bear trap. Slowly, he walked for more than an hour, and all the large traps were placed. The sky began to get dark. Abel was packing up his things, preparing to go back to the castle. There were still 2 hours before the sky was completely darkened. Until then, he could still see his way back. At that moment, suddenly he heard a painful, yet angry scream from the distance. A beast must have fallen for his gigantic bear trap. Only a beast could have made a noise in this forest. Abel strapped his horse next to a tree and rushed in the direction of the sound. As Abel was running, he was constantly observing the surrounding environment, and the marking he made. It would be hilarious if he had fell for his own trap. After running for 10 minutes, Abel found the marking that he made. He slowed down and walked gently into the trap. Although the sharp clamps had been triggered, there was no prey to be found anywhere. Abel squatted down and touched sharp teeth of the clamp with his hands. There was blood. What triggered the trap might not be a beast after all. Although Abel doesn't know what else could have triggered it, a beast definitely would not have the intelligence to free itself from it, especially without the help of a human hand. If the beast was very powerful, at most, it would just destroy the trap, not leaving it enclosed like this. Could it be human? Abel shook his head. The voice he had just heard was clearly not human. That, he could be certain of. Chapter 30, Simon the Wargen. Not far from where the gigantic bear trap was placed, Abel spotted even more bloodstains on the ground. As he resumed his search following the directions of the blood trails, he suddenly stumbled across another spot of bloodstains which wasn't too far from the original directions that he had come from. Abel continued to follow the blood trail. From the looks of it, the prey didn't seem to be injured badly. It was probably just a leg. However, as he continued, he thought that maybe the wound on the prey's leg might be quite serious since it bled continuously. Abel's hunting instinct and experience in his previous life had taught him that when prey was injured, they instinctively sought the most secure and safe place for themselves to recover from the injury. This would probably be the case with this prey as well. After following the blood trail for around 30 minutes, Abel suddenly saw lights from a fire in front of him. Abel felt confused and found it strange. Humans would never have survived or habited in a place like this. As he slowly approached the fire, Abel saw in the distance a creature that he had never seen before treating its own leg wounds. The creature had a head that looked like a wolf, 2 canine teeth protruding from the outside, alongside with a body that resembled a human. However, it had a slightly more curved back with a height of around a little over 2 meters. Next to the creature was a huge mysterious wolf resting on the ground. The belly of the wolf seemed to be so large that it looked as if it was pregnant. Abel was now certain that the creature in front of him was the wolf troopers that attacked the village that he saw earlier, and the wolf that was resting near it must be the legendary Mount Wolf. Once again, Simon was out of luck. He hid in the jungle, away from the humans. Every day, he hunted for food to keep himself and the Mount Wolf well fed. One day, he went out to hunt just like any other ordinary days. He had already familiarized himself with the environment during these days, therefore he had lowered his awareness when moving around the forest. It was an everyday routine for him. During his hunt, he went onto a route that he was extremely familiar with. It was the route that he had took many times and it was the safest road to him. But suddenly, he stepped on something strange. It looked to be two giant elephants' teeth that clamped through his legs. The pain that he suffered when he stepped onto the trap made him furious. It was so painful that he screamed repeatedly. He didn't know what it was, but he was certain that it belonged to the humans. After a while, he realized that even though the trap looked scary, it wasn't particularly painful, and it only injured him a tiny bit. It didn't even break the bones of his leg, it was just a sharp serrated tooth that tore his skins with the muscle of his lower legs. Most importantly, the trap was easy to break, too. All he did was to gather up all his strength and pry it open with his hands. However, his injured leg still needed to be treated. All the precious medical supplies were left back in his camp. Therefore all he could now was to limp back slowly to his camp, so that he could treat his wound. As Simon treated his wound, he thought to himself. There have been sightings of humans around this area, and it was no longer safe to stay here. It looked like they may have to move to another area. With Simon's Mount Wolf Black Wind having to give birth in these upcoming few days, the best time to move away would be tomorrow. To Simon, the quicker they moved, the better. With the birth of a small Mount Wolf, they will lose all their mobility. All of a sudden, Simon's nose picked up a different scent in the air. It was the scent of humans. Simon then ferociously stood up with a worried facial expression on his face and looked around carefully to scan for any danger. Abel observed with extreme caution as the worgen got up and peeked around. Suddenly, Abel realized the worgen must have sensed his presence from a distance. As a worgen, Simon had an extremely strong and terrifying sense of smell. The moment he picked up the scent of Abel, Simon knew that this human was the one who injured him. These inferior humans would need to use such despicable methods to injure him. He was ready to do anything he could to find the bastard who did this and wipe him out the surface of the earth. When Abel realized that he was spotted by the worgen was already dashing directly towards his direction from afar. At that moment, Abel knew he was in big trouble. From the vigorous look of this worgen, it at least possessed the fighting ability of a novice knight, which to say this wolf rider was at least level 6. While Abel was only a rank 5 novice knight, he was only one rank away from being in rank 6. However, the probation between knights that were level 1 to 5 only had one combat chi force. The power of the force was determined through level based, level 1 being the weakest while level 5 being the strongest. However, their combat chi was only available to fire once at a time, since novice knights did not have a core to generation more combat chi. Therefore, once they used up all their chi in their meridian, it would require at least a few days for them to recover before using it again. The combat chi was like an amplifier for power. If a professional could produce around 500 pounds of force, his combat chi would be capable of doubling that power to 1,000 pounds. For level 6 professional, they can use the combat chi multiple times, thus multiplying their attacking strength. However, level 5 or below only has one shot to double their strength. Therefore, their difference in strength could not be matched no matter how good the weapons and accessories are. If Abel used his large sword against Simon the worgen, the only outcome would be that Abel being excluded by the force of the sword, while Simon only slowed down a bit by the ice magic of the sword. When Abel thought about it, he suddenly had an idea. He wasn't going to fight the worgen. Since he saw the injury on the worgen's legs, maybe he could have a chance to escape. When Simon saw that the man, not only was he unwilling to engage in combat but was turning around and running away, he thought to himself, what a coward that human was. With little regard to his injury, Simon began to make a chase after Abel. Originally, Abel thought that since the worgen's leg was injured, he surely would have run faster than the worgen. However, the wagon was still the fastest predator in the Holy Continent. Ever since Simon began to chase after Abel, he had been catching up closer and closer to his speed at every second. Abel estimated his current distance to the worgen. If he used the exploding sword with a 3-second wait time, he could cause severe damage, or even kill the worgen. However, with all these forests nearby, with the speed of the wagon, it could use these trees as cover and dodge the majority blast. The exploding sword only had one attack. The best chance for Abel would have been when the worgen was unprepared for his attack. However, if the first attempt was unsuccessful, the second attempt would be even less likely to succeed as the worgen would have raised his awareness. Abel took out a crossbow, which was already loaded with an arrow. He immediately looked back and aimed at the head of the worgen and fired. The worgen had extremely precise reaction time. He instantly dodged the arrow. The worgen was now even closer. Abel realized he didn't have any time left to reload his crossbow, so he made a quick decision. Abel threw his crossbow directly at the worgen, who was rapidly catching up to him. The worgen's paws caught the crossbow in the air, and within seconds, the crossbow became a pile of trash on the ground. With not much time left, Abel lastly took out the crossbow made by the dwarf. However, he only got the chance to fire it once before it became useless again. With no more ranged weapons equipped with Abel, the only option now was to use the trees to distance himself from the worgen. Abel kept changing directions. By doing so, he could slowly keep his current distance against the worgen. As Abel sprinted, Abel quickly caught a glimpse of a familiar sign with the corner of his eyes. He realized that it was the trap he had set earlier. Simon became more and more frantic. The blood of the orc seemed to boil within him. He gave a great shout, and his muscles were immediately all ferociously tensed. It even transformed him from 2 meters large into 2.5 meters. Simon's speed seemed to change significantly too. Abel suddenly felt the worgen's breathing behind him. When he looked at the sign again, he was already at his trap that he set earlier. He lunged forward as he held his ground between the two traps that were placed on the ground. The front hand of the trap flipped, which turned over the second trap. This allowed Abel to escape the attack from the worgen claw from behind. The worgen screamed with a cry of "ow wow." Simon's legs were caught again. As he ran, the chain of the gigantic trap was tied to the tree pole at one end, and the strong pulling force caused Simon to fall onto the ground. Abel saw the worgen lying down on the ground, and before the worgen's hand could pull open the clamp, Abel had pulled out an exploding sword from the Horadric Cube. Before the white light flashing in the explosion of the sword, Abel was already on the ground taking cover, and the light shield at the waist was tilted in front of him to protect him from the explosion. Simon saw a bright, shining white sword flying towards him. It was not moving very fast, which surprised him. But at the same time, an instinctive sense of fear arose from the depths of his body. Then immediately the sword exploded. There was a loud bang, and Abel's shield jingled in front of him. When everything became quiet, he stood up, and the trapped worgen was covered in blood. Particularly in the middle of its fear-filled eyes, a hole was gushing out blood. A piece of debris had directly struck the wagon on its head. Abel approached the worgen. The worgen, who was 2.5 meters in shape, had transformed back to 2 meters upon its death. Due to the transformation of the worgen earlier, the clothes made from the fur on its body have broken open and something was protruding outside. As Abel took out that something from the blood-smeared worgen, it was a sheepskin paper. On the paper was some kind of orc's text with a map and some strange piece of branding. On the brand was carved with a long curved horn and a lion's face. The lion looked to have more developed muscles of the body than a normal human, along with sharp claws on its hand followed by a pair of toe shoes. The lion was the god of the orcs. As Abel investigated further, he found that at the bottom of the brand, there was a star. If there were orcs here, they would have known the importance of this sign. These were special orc ability skill cards. Each sign was sealed with a powerful ability. Because most of the orcs had no written language, the orc gods used this method to preserve these skills, and the orcs learned their skills through these signs. The sign that Abel found had another star. This meant there's still another opportunity, the special, to learn the special orc ability. Even though it was not known where Simon had gotten the special orc sign, but the rarity of this orc sign was beyond doubt even for ordinary orcs. Chapter 31, Orc Skill Card. Abel knew what an orc's skill card was. He knew what it was, but the card had a power that was so strange that he had to take a closer look at it. For reasons he wasn't sure of, he was somehow attracted by it in ways that he couldn't describe. Abel decided to use his power of the will on the card. He closed his eyes for a bit and decided to focus all his senses on the mysterious force that was lingering by. As his conscience began to enter the card, he felt an energy that was similar to the one that his body produced. It was the power of one's spirit. It was probably not a human spirit, though. Without asking for Abel's permission, this energy began to draw itself closer towards him. It was trying to synchronize with him. Abel didn't want to, but it was too late before he could switch off his power of the will state. Whilst trying to open his eyes, Abel realized that he had become a young wargen himself. It kind of felt like a movie for him, except it was much more realistic than a movie. He had no control over his body, but everything he saw was very much in detail. The wargen, Abel, walked to the front of a mounted wolf. It placed its hand on top of the beast's head, then uttered some very strange words from his mouth. It was not a language that Abel had learned about before, but bizarrely enough, he could understand every word of it. As devoted followers of the beastly gods, the wargens would often include words of praise in their vocabulary. They would also use weird consonants to match the words that they were saying, which allowed them to communicate their thoughts with the Mount Wolves, kind of like what Abel was seeing here. The wargen could understand what the Mount Wolf was thinking, and so could the Mount Wolf to the wargen. The wargen would have sent a command to the Mount Wolf without having said anything, and the Mount Wolf would follow it after receiving it telepathically. After riding on the Mount Wolf for a while, the wargen used its combat chi and gave it a full body massage. Things were looking very tranquil here, but the scene got cut off for some reason. Without being able to watch what happened next, Abel's mind was returned to his body. There was a star at the bottom of the skill card. As Abel switched off his power of the will state, it started fading away and eventually disappeared. The card, too, was destroyed after that. Abel was afraid of it exploding like his heavy sword, so he threw it away into the air before he got injured by it. Luckily, the card didn't explode. Instead, it just kind of fizzled out and ceased to exist. The skill card did a lot for Abel. Because of it, he learned how to speak the language of the orcs, as well as being able to use the mount enhancement technique on any rideable animal. Technically speaking, however, the card itself did not have the function to teach Abel another language. He only learned the orc's tongue because he was reading it with his power of the will state on, which synchronized his psyche to the young wargen that he saw. Despite regional differences, the orcs spoke a common language, which was also the one that was used to make the skill card's content. Through the acts of worshipping beastly gods, they would transfer whatever skills they possess into the cards, with the mount enhancement technique being one of them. By now, Abel's pretty much had a full understanding of what the skill card was. It was something that was used by the Orc Empire. Unlike the orcs who used their blood to activate it, Abel used his power of the will. While there were upsides with using this method, it was also risky in its own ways. If the priest who made this card were in a higher rank, there was no telling of what would happen to Abel's mind. Having learned the language of the orcs, Abel picked up the parchment map and started reading it. It was a map marked with times and locations of where the invasion troop would be rallied. Abel was very excited to recognize it, because by doing so, he could, very easily, stop the invaders from entering into the realms of humanity. Honestly, though, such important intel should have never been brought by a regular orc. The humans got lucky this time. If Simon didn't leave his team to wait for the Mount Wolf to give its birth, he would have never had to draw a copy of the map while in hiding. It was getting late now. After realizing so, Abel finally remembered that his horses were still in the Wargen's camp. He then walked back slowly to where he came from. While the two horses were still there, there was also a mount wolf that was sitting next to them. As the wargen had killed off any wild beasts nearby, the horses remained calm as they chewed on the grass that was below them. The mount wolf stood up at the sight of Abel. Realizing how long its master had gone, it raised its head in a worrisome manner. What a shame! An adult mount wolf could only recognize one master for the entirety of its own life. With the wargen being killed, there was no longer a cause for it to be alive. Abel slowly walked towards the mount wolf. He revealed his ice magic sword from his back and slowly approached the beast. The mount wolf wasn't looking to fight back, though. If anything, there was a very strong sadness that was displayed in its eyes. Master didn't come back, but it was an enemy that had come to end its life. The mount wolf began to wail, almost as if it was trying to beg for mercy. Abel felt kind of confused to see this. While the night was near, he could still see a small shadow, struggling its way out of its dying mother. Whilst going against what Abel has learned before, the mount wolf was giving off birthright here, out in a battlefield that was extremely close to the enemy's territory. The Orc Empire was supposed to be very strict in controlling their livestock. They were not supposed to let any pregnant mount wolf be in any sort of danger, let alone letting it inside the human world. What Abel was witnessing now was an outlier, a phenomenon that was, by all means, not supposed to be. Since the Orc Empire was the one that controlled the mount wolf population, most humans would have never seen one in their whole life. That being said, humans knew very little about how they behaved. It wasn't like they were completely clueless, though. For starters, it was rumored that mount wolves recognize the first living thing they see as their masters. They were also known to be extremely loyal and would go to extreme lengths to protect the ones they thought to be important. Because of their intelligence and extraordinary speed, mount wolves were regarded as one of the most valuable animals to be owned in this world. For people in this world, a good animal to ride on was the same as a racing car. The fanaticism behind was pretty much the same, even more so when the opportunity to see one was so rare. As Abel stood where he was, the mount wolf began to focus back on giving off birth. Despite being in a lot of agony, it didn't make any sound as it was afraid of being a hindrance to its stillborn offspring. Eventually, the little thing came out and rested beside its mother. The mount wolf, as it had fulfilled in its role, was too tired to even keep its eyes opened. It laid right where it was at and tried to have some rest. However, such things were a luxury in the presence of a foe. The mount wolf raised its head to look at Abel. It then looked down its head and began licking the furs of its own child. Through this very fact, there was a very strong love and a sense of satisfaction that was being conveyed. Suddenly, the mount wolf stood up from the ground and ran towards an old tree, which was about 50 centimeters in its width. Abel thought that it was trying to attack him and quickly readied himself for defense. However, there was no longer a reason for conflict. The mount wolf had crashed its skull against the tree. Without bothering Abel, it had ended its own life in the quickest way possible. What boldness and loyalty! The mount wolf loved its child, but nothing stood in the way for it to devote everything to its master. Not even its own child, and not even its own life. Abel raised his ice magic sword and started digging on the ground. Within no time at all, he's dug up a hole that was big enough to bury the mount wolf in. It was just an animal, yes, but it was a dignified spirit that was deserving of respect. He didn't want the other beasts to ravage on its remains. After the burial was done, the baby pup began to cry, as if mourning for the being that gave it its own life. Upon hearing this, Abel picked it up from the ground and wrapped his arms around it. It was a very light puppy, covered in black furs that were drenched from being licked. It was soft, so soft that Abel had to try very hard not to hurt it. It was an innocent life which, for reasons Abel wasn't sure of, made him felt like he was its own father. Chapter 32, Abel's own mount wolf. As though having found its mother, the mount wolf pup kept on rubbing its head against Abel while it was in his arms. For Abel, it felt kind of itchy for him, in a good way, sort of. He started patting the pup on its head, which had responded by rubbing its head against Abel even more. Abel carried the pup towards his horses. Now that he's found himself a new partner, he was even less keen on spending the night in the forest. There was nothing he could feed it here. For that reason, he had to go back to Harry Castle now. Just when Abel was about to approach his horses, they started panicking at the scent of the baby mount wolf. Understandably enough, wolves were a natural predator for beasts such as them. While this particular wolf was just a puppy, their instincts were telling them very much otherwise. After patting the horses on their backs, Abel was able to calm them down enough to proceed his way back home. He held the reins in one of his hands and used another to hold on to the baby mount wolf. He wasn't riding the horses, though. It wasn't safe to ride horses in the middle of a forest. Besides, the sky was starting to turn dark, so the only way he could go home was on foot. As he held on to the baby mount wolf, it started raising its head to lick his face. Its crystal eyes were looking straight at him, as though it had already decided to follow him for the rest of its life. And it did, indeed. Mount wolves were loyal beasts. While such a tendency was uncommon for other animals, they decide their masters from the moment they were born. With one of his hands holding onto the mount wolf, Abel placed another on top of its head. His rank wasn't high enough for him to transfuse his combat chi into it, but he did remember the spells for mount enhancement. By uttering the same enchantments as the orcs would praise their beastly gods, he could forge a spiritual pact with it. It's good that no one else was around. If they heard Abel speaking the language of the orcs, he would have been sent to a temple to be executed. Well, that's if they understood it in the first place. Actually, who cares? Abel was in a forest. No one was going to see him breaking any taboos. On a side note, most of the abilities that the orcs possessed had something to do with their faith. They had great admiration and respect for the gods that they worshipped, and would often include words of praise in the spells that they used. As Abel enchanted the magical words, a green light began to flash on the hand that was placed on top of the mount wolf's head. It started flashing bigger, and eventually surrounded everything that was around them. While the light was too bright for Abel to see, he could hear a weak cry that was calling out to him. It was a cry of happiness, of a love that was so pure that even the strongest forces couldn't break it apart. Abel felt it. He felt it from the bottom of his heart and was moved to allow it into his soul. Eventually, the green light became so thin that it vanished in the air, but the bond that was built only grew stronger by the minutes. Just by being around the mount wolf, Abel could know what it was feeling. Come to think of it, Abel hadn't named the mount wolf yet. Since it was covered in black furs, the first thing he's thought of was Black Wind. When the pup reached its adulthood, he wanted it to run as fast as the wind. Your name is now Black Wind. Is that okay with you, Black Wind? Abel wanted to explain his thoughts behind this name, but the pup was too young to understand something so complex as symbolism. Anyways, Black Wind, it shall be. You're not against it, are you? I don't sense that you have anything against it. Alright, I'll call you Black Wind from now on, then. Having named the mount wolf, Abel walked back the battleground and saw the dead wargen lying on the ground. If he was just going to leave it right there, no one was going to believe that he had killed wargen by himself. Not wanting to let his achievements go to waste, Abel carried the dead wargen and put it on top of his horse. He then continued his way back to Harry Castle. It was getting kind of dark in the forest. After stopping for a bit, Abel made a torch from a branch he picked up from the ground. Luckily for him, apart from a few snakes that he encountered, there weren't a lot of large beasts on his path back. Things were kind of going well for him. After walking for a few more hours, Abel came out of the forest and went back to Harry Castle. Oddly enough, the front gate was looking different from what it used to be. There were torches hung on the wall and a lot more guards who were patrolling around. "Who's that?" one of the guards called out as Abel approached the front gate. In just a few seconds, more guards came and had their arrows pointed towards him. It's Abel. Abel raised his torch so that it was closer to his face. Open the door so I can go in. The young master's back. Master Abel. As the guards began cheering for Abel, they lifted the castle gate and allowed him to enter. To Abel's surprise, he saw a lot of tents when he had just come in. Every time he was about to pass by one of them, people would come out and say hello to him. Good night to you, sir. Sir Abel. Master Abel. From what Abel could see, these were all farmers who lived in the Hairy Knight's domain. They came inside Hairy Castle because of the orcs' invasion. The Knight of Marshall must have sent them in during the daytime. Speaking of the Knight of Marshall, he didn't have any sleep at all. He was getting so worried that Abel hadn't come back, so he just stayed in his office whilst having his armor on. He did hear that Abel was out to test his new weapons, but because of how late it was, he's already sent a few men to search in the forest. For the Knight of Marshall, it was a difficult thing for him to not know where Abel was. Besides helping out his good friend, the Knight of Bennett, he took Abel in because he wanted an heir to take on his family name. In that sense, Abel didn't need to do anything to be helpful to him. However, what this child did over the past few months was simply far beyond all expectations. Because of Abel's achievements during the invasion outside Harvest City, the Knight of Marshall was rewarded with his weapon store. Because of Abel's ability to make magic weapons, Hairy Castle was now one of the most fortified castles around Harvest City. Because of Abel's status as a master blacksmith, the Knight of Marshall was a celebrity figure whenever he went. Abel was a phenomenon kid, and he was bound to be so much more than that. Whilst thinking about everything that Abel had done for him, the Knight of Marshall became even more worried about his disappearance. If the butler Lindsay didn't come in on time, he would have gone to the forest himself to look for Abel. Master, Sir Abel is back, the butler Lindsay said with a rushed tone. It was rare for him to be this intrusive, but understandably so. He came back, the Knight of Marshall exclaimed and ran to the Hairy Castle's front gate. As happy as he was to see that Abel was alive, he found it strange that there was a corpse on one of the horses. The Knight of Marshall widened his eyes. Why did you bring a dead wargen back? Just after he said that, the Knight of Marshall began to notice something even stranger. Abel was holding a Mount Wolf pup in his arms. It wasn't supposed to be here, but somehow, it was right here and it was looking straight at him. The Knight of Marshall said with a shaky voice, "Is that a Mount Wolf you're holding, Abel?" Wait a second. Oh my, it is a Mount Wolf. Where did you found it, Abel? Has it found a master yet? As a knight who survived the war against the orcs, the Knight of Marshall was very much in awareness of how precious a Mount Wolf was. That being said, it was a miracle for Abel to bring back one that was just yet born, and an even greater myth for it to be collected with a dead wargen. The wargen must have been at least rank 6 for it to appear next to a pup, but who could have had killed it? There was no way that Abel could have killed anything that was at rank 6, but who or what else could have done it? Whilst facing the mountain of questions that were thrown at him, Abel was at a loss for words. He didn't expect such a strong reaction from the Knight of Marshall, so it was hard for him to start explaining the things that he saw. For now, though, Black Wind was hungry, so the first thing he did was to ask for some sheep milk from the butler Lindsay. Chapter 33, Going Back to the Castle. Once returned to the Hairy Castle's main hall, Abel told everything that he saw to the Knight of Marshall. At the same time, he's also brought the map that was drawn on the parchment paper. Thankfully enough, the Knight of Marshall was able to read some of the characters that were used by the orcs. He had recognized some of the locations marked on the map and was able to point out some of the more crucial routes for those invaders. The Knight of Marshall walked around the room whilst having an extremely intense expression on his face. This map is way too important for us, Abel. With this in our hands, we can effectively stop these orcs from ever entering into the realm of mankind. I don't think the orcs are going to be too easy to fight off this time, Abel said with concern. I'm not sure about the exact numbers, but the wolf riders I've faced are all at least above rank 6. We won't have enough archers for them if they keep coming at this pace. The Knight of Marshall wasn't too worried. If anything, he was very optimistic about this whole situation. Why, of course, we're not going to take on them all. Here's the deal, I give this map to the Lord of Harvest City, and we do fend off the invasion this time and have enough dead orcs on our hands. Abel, you are going to be anointed as a lord. The Knight of Marshall then said with a more serious tone, for now, Abel, you are not allowed to be out without a company. Whenever you leave the castle, you must let someone know first and bring some guards with you. As for that Mount Wolf you've picked up, well, don't tell the others about it. I'll tell the others to keep their mouths shut as well. Once they've reached a certain rank, Mount Wolves tend to stay loyal to their owners. The Knight of Marshall sighed, same with that one. That being said, there's always going to be someone who would try to take it back. Whatever you say, Uncle, Abel said without complaint. For all intents and purposes, the Knight of Marshall knew a lot more than he did about how the nobles were like. Besides, Black Wind was still a puppy. Once it had reached full size, Abel would have grown so strong already that no one could take anything away from him. To be honest, however, this kind of thought process just showed how little the Knight of Marshall and Abel knew about the Blacksmith Guild. If Master Bentham was here, he would have warned these scoundrels about the severe consequences of crossing a human with the title of a Master Blacksmith. Do you still have those large beast traps with you? The Knight of Marshall asked. While he was well aware of how terrifying the wolf riders were, he was very interested in finding ways to slow them down. I don't have them with me now, Abel replied without expecting to be asked about his traps. I've set up all 10 of them in the forest behind the castle. I did mark them, though. If you want to, I can retrieve them by tomorrow. Can you have the other blacksmiths make it for you? The Knight of Marshall asked urgently. Abel shook his head, probably not, I think. There's a special technique that I've used to make one of the parts. Having become a master blacksmith himself, Abel knew how far technology had progressed in this world. That being said, not many people could make a metal spring the same way as he did. To produce the special metal that was needed to make a spring, one would have to use a large amount of carbon to reduce the steel's durability, meanwhile ensuring that its elasticity was maintained. Forget the humans, only masters dwarves could handle work as delicate as this. Can you make a lot of these traps for me, Abel? I know they are meant for hunting, but they could also be great defense tools if we lay them around the castle. Yes, Abel affirmed, all I need to do is to make the more complex parts. You can have the other blacksmiths make the simpler parts. Sure. Make as many of those crucial parts. Do it whenever you have free time. I want those traps in place as early as possible, the Knight of Marshall said impatiently. Go tell the patrol squad where you've set up the trap, and they will get them for you. And don't go out for the next few days. I've already moved the blacksmith shop into the castle. Things are going very dangerous outside the castle. At night, after returning to his bedroom, Abel got some warm sheep milk from Lindsay and fed it to Black Wind. In order to not spill it, he's also asked for a sheet of gerbil skin. A gerbil was kind of like a rat. Because of how thin and soft its skin was, it was often used to make all sorts of small textile objects. With that mind, Abel asked the maid to make a pacifier for him. While the resulting product was not very aesthetically appealing, he did get himself a very useful feeding bottle in the end. With the pacifier next to its mouth, Black Wind started suckling for some sheep milk. Its premature teeth bit hard onto the bottle, and its tiny face looked very satisfied when it was doing so. Abel never had a pet when he was living on Earth. He didn't know the feeling of having a pet, and he's never understood the people who would treat pets like they were their own children. For a while, though, he's really thought of Black Wind as his own baby. Meanwhile, the Knight of Marshall had sent the parchment map to Lord Dickens. To fully earn Lord Dickens's trust, he even had his men sending a whole dead body of a wargen. To be honest, if it wasn't because of how urgent things were, he would have paid the visit himself in person. The next morning, after waking up from his bed, Abel came to the de facto blacksmith shop that was set up in the castle storage. With the help of Master Bentham and the other men, he gathered up all the blacksmiths and began instructing them on the parts that were to be made. By now, Abel had become quite familiar with creating his beast trap. For the large, thick springs that were essential to this piece, he would spend a whole day making 15 replicas of them. He did this for 3 days. The other blacksmiths were quite fast, too. Under Abel's instructions, they, too, managed to make all the other parts after 3 days. Having assembled all the parts together, Master Bentham started filing the edges of all the teeth on the traps. This was so that the blades would dig deeper when the prey had fallen for it. Thanks to how experienced the patrol squad was, the other 10 traps were also retrieved back from the forest. There were now 25 beast traps ready for defending Harry Castle. To test the effectiveness of his new trap, Abel threw a branch on top of the pressure pad, which, in a blink of an eye, was penetrated by its razor-sharp teeth. If the branch was the leg of a mount, then the wargen riding on top of it would have immediately lost the ability to move. All in all, it was a result that the Knight of Martial was very satisfied with. And that should have just about ended the invasion right there. To begin with, orcs would have never attacked a castle with just a few squads on their side. The walls were too high for their steads to have any use, and a forced push would only result in unnecessary casualties. They were not technologically advanced enough to develop any sort of siege engine. With all that out of the way, the only asset that they had were their wolves, but even a rank 7 wolf rider couldn't jump over a castle gate. As powerless as the orcs were against a fort, the Knight of Martial had everyone concentrated to the center of the hairy castle. He reinforced some of the castle's weak spot with the large beast traps, especially in the forest somewhere 30 meters behind the fort. If the orcs were looking for an invasion, he would need to stop them from having any access to a large amount of timber. If the traps were activated, the scouts would know the direction of the attack right away. After finishing the traps requested from him, Abel was finally spared with some free time of his own. Instead of taking a break, though, he decided to reminisce about his last encounter with the wargen. Looking back, that fight with the wargen had really made he understood his difference to someone with an official occupation. Yes, a rank 5 novice knight was only a rank away from an official occupation holder, but a rank 5 novice knight could not multiply his powers with combat chi. Despite its injury, that wargen had completely outpaced Abel in every conceivable way. Honestly, he was being completely dominated at the time. If it wasn't for his luck, he wasn't even sure if he would stand where he was right now. Once having reached the rank of a beginner occupation holder, one could utilize his combat chi to increase his physical strength. On the other hand, an intermediate occupation holder could channel his combat chi to his weapon. It was the same technique as the one that the Knight of Martial had used outside of Harvest City. By loading his energy onto his heavy sword, both the power and the sharpness of his weapon were increased by double. That just showed how insane this technically was. Things didn't stop there, though. After becoming an advanced occupation holder, one could essentially launch mid-range attacks with his combat chi. On the battlefield, he could even overpower an army of about 100 men. This marks the end of part 6 of the story, Abe the Wizard. Thank you for listening. Please like the video and hit the subscribe button to listen more. Hit the bell icon to get notified of all the new content uploaded to the channel ASAP.